Merci, et je partage.
Thank you. I'll be sharing my time with the Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte. Madam Speaker, we are reliving an economic and scientific experiment that politicians are proposing every 30 years or so. Just after people have forgotten what happened last time we had this experiment. The experiment is as follows. That politicians should see the economy as follows. If something moves, we tax it. If it keeps moving, we regulate it. If it stops moving, we subsidize it. And that is exactly the approach taken by the current government. We saw a government that has created a Canada that is the second longest country when it comes to obtaining a construction permit. We have regulations. That means that it takes 25 years to approve a mine. We have a country that applies the highest level of tax on SMEs, which hampers economic development. Let us talk, for example, about housing. The Prime Minister, since he came to power, presides upon a country that has the fewest number of houses per capita in the G7, even if we have so much land. Why? Because sometimes it takes 10 years to approve a construction development. What does the Prime Minister do? He subsidizes and grants huge checks to municipal politicians who hamper these construction projects. And that is why Vancouver is the third most overpriced city in the world. Toronto is 10th. Even if we are a country with a lot of land here in Canada, the average home is almost double that in the USA, even if they have 10 times a bigger population than we do on a smaller mass of land. At the same time, the government stopped 2 oil pipelines and subsidized a third. So, on one hand, they're against private sector oil pipelines, but for those subsidized by the government, they are for. And now they're spending $30 billion to subsidize a pipeline in Western Canada that could have cost nothing to taxpayers. This is the same kind of projects that are done for free for the taxpayer throughout the world. The Prime Minister is boasting about subsidies for a so-called strategy for electrification. At the same time, the government is stopping mines in Northern Ontario that could produce this kind of product for electrification. Why is the government stopping, on one hand, that which it approves and subsidizes? On the other hand, why not do neither and just allow investors, businesses, workers, entrepreneurs to do so themselves? The answer is because it would remove the Prime Minister's role in all of this. It's a consistent ploy. Every time they force people to go through him and the state to do whatever they want. He has to be at the head of any decision. He is the one who decides what people do in our economy. It should be the people that decides what to do with the economy. Everyday people who do work, there are real consequences and real costs. We see that Canada is the country that has the worst economic growth in the OECD over the next 30 years. We have housing costs that have doubled. Food costs have accelerated at the fastest pace in 40 years. When the state hinders the natural and organic progression of the market just to subsidize it. It adds costs to everyday citizens who have to pay more. Madam Speaker, there's another way to do things. Removing bureaucratic obstacles, allowing the construction of hydroelectricity facilities, mines, for materials for electrification, producing more of our electricity here in Canada instead of importing it from elsewhere. By removing red tape and delays, and by incentivizing municipalities so that they remove their bureaucracy so that we can have affordable housing for everyday Canadians. The good approach is to free Canadians so that they can produce a better quality of life at a lesser cost. That, Madam Speaker, that is logical. Together, let us bring back logic to Canada. That is our objective, and that's exactly what we will do.
We are now living through an experiment. It's not an unprecedented experiment. It's tried about every 30 years as soon as the last experiment is forgotten. It's the idea that the government, if the government sees something that moves, they tax it. If it keeps moving, they regulate it. If it stops moving, they subsidize it. This is, of course, a quote I take from a famous American president who took the opposite approach. But it is the approach that we're living with right now. What are the results of a government that interferes to block Canadians from building things for themselves and then tries to subsidize that very building after the fact? The result is that the cost of everything is rising. The cost of government is driving up the cost of living. The government has produced $500 billion of new money that bids up the goods we buy and the interest we pay. And now Canadians face the real threat of a mortgage meltdown when those rates rise further. We see this approach, though, played out again and again. For example, they block 2 pipelines, but then subsidize a third. It's not that they're against pipelines, Madam Speaker. It's just that they're in favor of only a pipeline that can be built with $30 billion tax dollars. Exactly. They block mines. They blocked all of the mines in Northern Ontario's Ring of Fire, and now they want to subsidize those very same mines.
Exactly.
They tax small businesses, and then they claim they're coming up with subsidies to bail out those very same small businesses for the cost that the government made them pay. They claim their carbon tax works like this. They'll take the money away and give it back, and somehow it'll be worth more than when it left. Madam Speaker, of course, we now know that everyday Canadians are paying more, vastly more, in these taxes than they get back in return. The experiment fails. Every 30 years or so it happens, and it's only allowed to happen because there's been enough time passing for people to forget its logical outcome.
Yes.
But the logical way out of it is to take exactly the opposite approach. Instead of taxing and blocking our industry and then subsidizing it, we should do neither. We should have real, sensible, streamlined rules that allow us to protect our environment and public safety, but allow our entrepreneurs, investors, industrialists to get things done. And that's what we will do when I'm Prime Minister. Let's set some wonderful, ambitious goals. Why don't we make the goal that instead of being the second slowest in the OECD to grant a building permit, why can't we be the fastest place to grant a building permit anywhere in the OECD? Why can't we approve a mine or a small modular nuclear reactor in 2 or 3 years rather than in 25 years? What do we learn in years 23, 24, and 25 that we could not have learned in years 1, 2, and 3 of these projects? Why don't we incentivize our municipalities to do what some are trying their very best to do? For example, the mayor of Walkerton just streamlined and sped up the approval of housing so that he could bring 3 60-unit apartment blocks in several months. In the Great Squamish people of Vancouver, right inside the city, don't have to follow Vancouver's bureaucratic rules because they control their own land. They were able to speed up and approve 6,000 units of housing on 10 acres of land. That's 600 units of housing per acre. That's people who will now have homes because the Squamish know how to do what so many local government bureaucrats do not allow, which is to approve projects and get them built. It reminds me of the great Aubrey Moody, who was the mayor of Nepean. And Jack May went and saw him on a Sunday morning before he'd gone to go to church and said, "I want to build a car dealership. I've got a piece of land." The next day, at the local town hall, The lawyers sat down with the engineers, they stamped and within 48 hours there was approval, and within 72 hours there was construction, and the car dealership is still standing safely there 70 years later. That's common sense. And in that way, we can build homes that people can afford, build businesses that pay higher paychecks, lower the burden of tax on the backs of the hardworking people, let them bring home more of their paychecks. That is the purpose of our government. It is to make Canada work for the people who do the work, by bringing home lower costs, by eliminating the carbon tax and the inflationary deficits, bringing home powerful paychecks with lower taxes that reward hard work, and by removing gatekeepers to build homes and to allow First Nations to develop their economies and our people to develop their own industry, bringing homes people can afford, by removing gatekeepers, freeing up land, speeding up permits to build, bringing home safe streets for our people with consequences for repeat violent offenders, not by targeting our lawful firearms owners, and bringing home our freedom again by eliminating the censorship and the centralized control that this government has attempted to impose on the people. So in other words, when we say bring it home, it means using this House to bring home the power, the control, and the money back into the hands of the entrepreneur, the worker, the everyday, extraordinary people who know better than anyone in this room how to chart their own course and live their own lives. It's common sense. It's the common sense of the common people, united for our common home, your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home.